All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, frankly, highly debated addition to biblical studies. It's called postcolonial biblical criticism. So, to really wrap our heads around this, we've got to start with a massive foundational question. What actually happens when we read the Bible through the eyes of the colonized? You see, whenever we read historical documents, especially ones as deeply foundational as the Bible, we naturally bring our own modern, sometimes kind of idealized assumptions to the table. For the longest time, traditional scholarship was super focused on uncovering the singular intent of the author. They treated the text mostly as a straightforward record of divine and human encounters. But here's the thing, no text is written in a vacuum. If we shift our perspective away from those supposedly neutral assumptions, it forces us to ask, who exactly held the geopolitical power when these words were being written down? And how were the people living under that crushing power responding? It's a complete reframing of how we interact with ancient literature.
And this reframing, it's absolutely crucial. Because let's be real, the Bible wasn't written in some peaceful, isolated bubble. Not at all. It was written in the shadow of massive, dominating empires. We're talking the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Power dynamics, conquest, subjugation, all of that is literally baked right into the history of these texts. The source material makes a really compelling argument here. Because the Bible originated in these intense, high-stakes colonial contexts, we actually need a specialized academic tool just to understand the subtle power plays hidden right there between the lines.
Enter post-colonial biblical criticism. This is exactly the tool for the job. It acts as an analytical lens to investigate power negotiations, colonization, and resistance within a text. Now, it's really important to clarify something based on our sources. This discipline, it doesn't claim to be some hard scientific method that hands you one absolute undisputed truth. It's not about just championing one identity over another either. Instead, think of it more like a detective's magnifying glass. It's specifically designed to unmask the hidden, sometimes really sly power dynamics operating between the colonizer and the colonized. It shows us how a colonial context directly informs the text and then how the text itself becomes a piece of that larger colonial puzzle. Interestingly enough, this lens wasn't actually invented by biblical scholars. It started over in secular English literary studies and built up momentum over several decades. Back in the 1950s, critics started looking at Commonwealth literature, basically writings from former British colonies. At first, they were just trying to find these universal, timeless values in the texts, totally ignoring the messy sociopolitical realities. But as you can imagine, that Eurocentric approach fell pretty flat. Then, 1961 hits and Frantz Fanon publishes The Wretched of the Earth. This was a huge deal. It profoundly unraveled the devastating psychological and cultural effects of colonialism and urged Native intellectuals to reclaim their own history. That sparked a massive wave of colonial discourse theories throughout the 1970s. But the real watershed moment, that was 1978, with Edward Said's landmark book, Orientalism, which completely exposed how the West used stereotyped representations of the East just to justify imperial rule. So as this whole discipline matured, it started pulling its theoretical tools from two major and honestly sometimes conflicting strands of thought. On one side, you have Marxism. Marxism brought the earliest empire-critical tools to the table, focusing really heavily on economic relationships and capitalist extraction. On the other side, you have French post-structuralism. This side was much more interested in cultural resistance, the ambivalence of identity, and the subtle, everyday ways that language and discourse wield power. Ultimately, though, scholars hit a bit of a roadblock. They realized classical Marxism had a major limitation when they tried to apply it to ancient colonialism. Because Marxism was so intensely focused on modern economic capitalism, it drew this really hard line between ancient political conquest and modern industrial profit-seeking. Its economic focus basically left very little wiggle room for studying biblical antiquity. It really struggled to account for the cultural side of things, the non-economic reality of these subject societies. Because of this, post-colonial theorists ended up leaning way more heavily into post-structuralism, just so they could grasp the nuanced cultural impacts of those ancient biblical empires. And that theoretical pivot paved the way for a sort of big three, a triumvirate of core theorists who really built the foundation of this post-colonial lens in the 80s and 90s. First is Edward Said, who, as we just touched on, unmasked how the West actively constructed biased knowledge about the colonial other. Next up is Gayatri Spivak.
She brilliantly argued that you can actually use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. She used Western deconstruction to take apart the cultural basis of Western imperialism itself. And finally, Homi Bhabha. He totally shifted the paradigm by conceptualizing the colonial relationship not as some rigid black and white binaries, but as a messy space of hybridity and ambivalence. He highlighted how the colonized can actually subvert authority through subtle adaptation and even mockery. Okay. So with all this rich, complex history and theory laid out, the obvious question is, how do we actually use this? How do we take these massive concepts, Orientalism, deconstruction, hybridity, and map them onto ancient scripture? Well, thankfully, our sources break the methodology down into a highly practical framework. Let's walk through it. Think of this as a dynamic 5-part checklist. Number 1, celebrate mini-narratives. Instead of just reading the grand dominant story, this lens actively looks for those silenced protests and marginalized voices tucked away in the margins of the text. Number 2, move beyond strict binaries. Postcolonialism doesn't just say colonizer equals pure evil, colonized equals pure innocence. It looks closely at the complex cultural cross-trading and assimilation that happens between them. Number 3, and this is a big one, place ancient colonialism right at the center of how the text was produced. It unearths the imperial intentions behind the very words. Number 4, actively subvert traditional claims that any interpretation is purely neutral or objective. And finally, number 5, dig out insights that actually translate to our modern post-colonial world today. It's an incredibly interdisciplinary approach that really thrives on poking at historical imbalances. But hey, to be fair and intellectually rigorous here, we have to acknowledge something. Every analytical lens has its cracks, and post-colonial biblical criticism is definitely no exception. It has faced some pretty significant pushback and critical evaluation from within the broader academic community. For instance, those materialist and Marxist critics we mentioned earlier, they push back hard. They argue that by relying so heavily on post-structuralism, this whole approach becomes reductionistic. It almost completely ignores the very real, brutal economic dimensions of colonialism. Plus, critics warn that it risks turning actual physical political resistance into nothing more than word games or textual strategies. Basically, if we focus too much on the text, we might forget about the real-world material suffering. Others point out that even the prefix post is problematic because it risks treating colonialism like it's the historically normal baseline that everything else revolves around. And finally, there's a major critique that the discipline tends to lump everything together, failing to distinguish between the wildly diverse, unique experiences of different colonized groups around the globe. Which brings us to this powerful quote from scholar Leela Gandhi, summarizing that last critique. She says, "A theory of postcolonialism which suppresses differences like these is ultimately flawed power and inequality." She really hits the nail on the head here. What she's pointing out is the real danger of treating all colonial experiences as if they're exactly the same. I mean, the experience of a native population subjected to imperial violence is completely different from a settler community trying to navigate their own identity. If this analytical lens ignores those differences, it might just accidentally perpetuate the very power imbalances it's trying to dismantle. So, bringing it all together, what is the core takeaway from our explainer today? It's simply this: no text and absolutely no interpretation is completely neutral. Whether you're all in on the post-colonial methodology with its focus on hybridity, or whether you align more with the Marxist critics who demand we look at economic realities, the fundamental insight remains. Our sources make it abundantly clear that power always leaves a footprint. Geopolitics, empire, domination, these forces didn't just shape how ancient texts were written, they shaped how the commentaries and interpretations of those texts have been handed down to us through the centuries. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to wrap up on. If the massive empires of antiquity left such a profound hidden mark on ancient biblical texts, how might the power dynamics of today be shaping the texts you read right now? Seriously, what hidden assumptions, cultural biases, and power structures are influencing the news, the literature, and the media you consume every single day? I really hope this explainer has given you a fresh, fascinating new lens to look at the world around you. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we'll catch you next time.